Hatfields and McCoys, my review of the 2012 TV miniseries from the History Channel. So this is part of what I've been calling my television addiction series, in which I go through and I discuss all the television shows I watched in the years 2011 and 2012 when I was living in Cambodia and had too much access to cheap DVDs and watched way too much TV. For more information on what this series is and why I'm doing it, you can check the video in the description down below in which I explain the premise behind this series. But yeah, the Hatfields and McCoys. For anyone who's not familiar, and you never know, maybe somebody who's from outside of the US might not be familiar. The Hatfields and the McCoys is a famous feud between two families in, I believe it was Kentucky and West Virginia, that took place in the area of America known as Appalachia or Appalachian Mountains, where there were these two families who got into a feud in the late 19th century, which resulted in several people being killed on both sides and both families. So a rather bizarre and rather horrifying episode of American history. But it's one of those little pieces of American history that's really not important in its own right, or certainly not important to be taught in any general survey of American history. It's more of like one of those bizarre little side stories. So I never heard about this in school. I suspect most people never hear about it in school. It's one of those little pieces of American history that you pick up by pop culture, which I suspect is how most people first heard about this. I mean, let me know in the comments down below. When did you first hear about the Hatfields and McCoys? They don't really teach it in school, but it's a big enough part of American folklore that it's all over pop culture. If memory serves, the first time I heard about it was in a Far Side cartoon. Far Side was at the height of its popularity when I was in 4th grade. And there was a cartoon of two alien kids, and they've got a jar full of Hatfields, and they've got a jar full of McCoys, and they're pouring the Hatfields into the McCoy jar. And I had no idea what that meant. So I had to go and ask my mom, which was quite common with the Far Side comics. It was very popular with kids my age, kids about in 4th grade. We really loved the kind of twisted humor of the Far Side, but we didn't get half of the references. So I had to ask my mom to explain it to me half the time. This was back in the days when the Far Side was appearing in newspapers daily. And my mom said, oh, right, the Hatfields and McCoys, they were these hillbilly families that had this big fight and were killing each other. And this just sounded bizarre to me and fascinating to me. For a number of reasons. I guess the macabre element of it, or the violent element of it, is fascinating to a young boy. But also the fact that these were families fighting and killing each other. Maybe it would be more accurate to say they were clans, but I didn't really know that at that point. I pictured, like a family unit, like the mother, the father, children, and in suburban America, the family has a very kind of innocent and sacred image. Family is, you gather on the holidays, and grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles, and everyone loves each other. And the idea that there are two families that were killing each other, just I couldn't quite process that in my imagination. And ever since then, I've been curious and wanted to know more. Now, way back when, this was the late 80s, there was really no internet that you could get up on and look this stuff up on Wikipedia. So you just picked up bits and pieces of it in pop culture. And it's in pop culture all over the place. There are references to it in Looney Tunes and various TV shows. And I mean, once you know what it is, you start catching all these passing references. I think the other place I remember hearing about this as a kid, I was a big Star Trek fan back when about the same age, back when I was in 4th grade. And one of the Star Trek books I was reading, which was one of those compendium books that goes through and kind of explains all the history behind the characters and stuff like that. You know, it wasn't like an official book, but it was one of those books that you can buy, like, you know, the guide to Star Trek. It explains all the characters and everything. And again, I think this is another example of something that was more popular before the internet, these books that you would get at bookstores that were companions to popular TV series. Now you don't need those books because you just go on Wikipedia. Anyways, sorry, I'm going off on a digression. One of those books, it said Dr. McCoy from Star Trek was a descendant of the McCoys from the Hatfields-McCoy feud. And that was another little connection I made from pop culture to this. Which, by the way, I'm not sure that that's true. I think that may have just been made up in that compendium book I got, because I don't ever remember that being uttered in any of the canonical Star Trek episodes. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, if there's any sort of reference to this in any of the Star Trek episodes, but I've watched a lot of Star Trek in my day, and I can't ever remember that being uttered in the show. Maybe I missed it, maybe I forgot. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if I'm missing something. Anyways, all of that is a long way of saying that I had always been curious to find out what the story between the Hatfields and the McCoys was, and I suspect I share that in common with a lot of people. I think a lot of Americans have my same history, where they hear about this thing through pop culture. It sounds like this bizarre feud. They don't really know what's going on. They want to know more, but where do you find out more? Well, I guess nowadays with Wikipedia. And sure enough, once Wikipedia came into its own around 2006, is my memory, I did spend an afternoon looking it up and kind of reading through the history of it on Wikipedia. But it's very hard to absorb that information when you just read it off the Wikipedia entry. It's just a bunch of names and people who got killed at certain times, and it's you know, Wikipedia is great, but I always find Wikipedia very difficult for absorbing history. I need something a bit more immersive to get it stuck in my mind. And then here comes a 3-part miniseries dedicated to retelling this story, and I thought, boy, I'm on board for that. I've always wanted to know the story behind this. Now, this came out in 2012, and this is, of course, not the first time that this series has been dramatized. Sorry, this historical event has been dramatized. I think it's been made into TV movies in the past, you know, back in the 1970s or something. But it's the first time I remember it. I think it's the first time, like in a generation, it's been made into a TV movie. Sorry, TV miniseries by the History Channel. And you may remember this got some publicity at the time. For a TV miniseries, it was a rather big event at the time. You know, it's funny, I was looking this up just right before I filmed this video to see if there was anything on YouTube that would refresh my memory a little bit about this series. And there's not much on YouTube. I was kind of hoping to find like a copy of this miniseries on YouTube that I could rewatch. And instead I found a copy of a completely different movie about the Hatfields and McCoys, which was also from 2012. Yeah, look this up, or try to. Apparently in 2012, there was a Lionsgate film, direct-to-DVD movie about the Hatfields and McCoys starring Christian Slater and a couple of other guys, which I didn't actually watch the whole thing. I don't know if it's worth watching or not, but it's it does not have a Wikipedia page dedicated to it. I mean, like if you go to Christian Slater's filmography, They mention it, but there's no link to the movie page. And if you go to the Hatfields and McCoys page on Wikipedia and go through, the depictions in popular culture or depictions in film, they mention this film. But apparently it wasn't noteworthy enough to warrant a Wikipedia page. But coincidence? Was this a coincidence? In 2012, there was also a Christian Slater movie released about the Hatfields and McCoys. But that's not the one I'm going to talk about. The one I'm going to talk about is the one that got all the publicity, the Kevin Costner, Bill Paxton, and Tom Berenger, and the Powers Booth, a few famous actors in there. And this was on the History Channel, I believe in May of 2012, and 3 parts. There was part 1, part 2, and part 3. It was a TV miniseries, and it was aired, each part was 2 hours. So like 6 hours of TV total. Now, I was living in Cambodia at the time, and it takes a while for these DVDs to hit the streets in Cambodia. So at the time this was on the History Channel, I was just reading the reviews of it. And again, this got a fair amount of publicity at the time, so there was a fair amount of reviews of this. And the reviews were mixed. Some people liked it, some people just thought it was blah, and some people thought it was negative. The primary critique of the negative reviews seems to be that it was just 6 hours of hillbillies feuding without giving you a reason why you should care about it. Or, by the time you were kind of 3 or 4 hours in, you had kind of forgotten what the feud was about, and you were just watching this back and forth, and it just was going on endlessly. At least that's what the critics were saying. That's what people who didn't like this miniseries were saying. It did hit the DVD stores in Cambodia a few months later, and I checked it out, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Now, it is true that the feud does go on and on for like 6 hours of runtime without really giving you a reason to care about it, except, isn't it all interesting to know the story about what happened? And say, oh, okay, so that's the way it went down, and that's how it escalated, and that's the series of events that led to this feud that I've always been catching references to in pop culture, but never really knew the full story behind. For me, that was worth the price of admission, so to speak, metaphorically. Just that was worth the investment in 6 hours, just to know all that, and just to finally figure out what the story actually was. And I thought it was well done, and it was interesting, and the acting was okay, and I found it completely watchable and interesting. Now, it is a dramatization. It is historical fiction. So you do have to be somewhat careful. They do change some things around and for dramatic purposes, etc., etc. Now, if you check Wikipedia after you watch the show or while you're watching the show, like I tend to do, the big events line up fairly well. They change a few things around and stuff like that, but and I'm not an expert, so take my opinion with a grain of salt, obviously, or do your own research. But for my money, I thought it seemed to line up with the historical record as I know it on Wikipedia. So I thought it gave me a fairly good idea of what the whole story behind that feud was. I did, however, find an interesting website, which I will link to in the description down below, which is the blog of someone who is a descendant of the Hatfield family. And she compares what she saw in the miniseries to the oral history that her family has handed down to her. Her primary complaint, or the big complaint right at the beginning, is nobody in the family was anywhere near as good looking as the Hollywood actors they got to portray them, like Kevin Costner, etc. So, fair enough. But then she goes on to some other things, talking about how it was actually, the timber rights which was actually the big feud behind the families, and not wasn't kicked off by like the hog or by the murderer, as is kind of shown in the miniseries. You know, again, I'm no expert. I'm not going to try and parse who's right and who's wrong, but I thought that was worth reading. So I'll link to her blog in the description down below. Yeah. Do I have anything more to say about this? No, not really. You know, this is a classic. I think this miniseries is interesting for you if you're interested in these episodes of American history. If you just want to know what happened for the sake of knowing, and you know, taking into account some dramatization with it, I found it really interesting. By the way, does anyone still watch this series anymore? Or is this another... I quite often have it on these television addiction series I'm doing as I look back on what was popular 8 or 9 years ago on TV. A lot of this stuff has just faded from the public consciousness, huh? This was a big TV event at the time, but nobody's watching it anymore, are they? I think if you want to watch it legally, you'd have to order the DVD from somewhere. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon or something. I found it interesting for what it was worth. Okay, I'm going to stop there.